All right, guys, let's start talking about how to create the population for your story world. So at this point, we've developed the soapbox, a world that needs the soapbox. We put in a high concept, which is the big commercial idea. We then separated it from convention by way of special sauce. That gives us the big idea. Then we took that big idea, we put it in an unfamiliar location. We built out the map of the primary location. We figured out how to extend that into a secondary location. We defined both of those by way of a map and really worked out the geography of the story world. But it doesn't help to have geography if you don't have people to live in your story world. Every story world needs some sort of population, some sort of some amount of characters to make this thing come alive. So we need to be thinking of how to develop the characters for our story world. And the way we're going to do that is not by thinking of singular characters. We're going to be developing what we call character groups. Okay, so traditionally in entertainment, people think they think of entertainment as through the lens of a singular character, right? I mean, you have your hero, you have your Harry Potter, you have your Luke Skywalker, right? You have Master Chief, whoever it is, and you develop through a character. But when you world build, you don't necessarily want to be thinking about individual characters. You want to be thinking about groups of characters, right? So what we're going to find is groups of characters increase your story potential with your story world. So we need to kick up to a 30,000 foot view of world building, not look through the lens of an individual, but think about groups, big groups. The more the better. I think that will help you. So when we're talking about groups, and the reason we want to do groups, think about Iron Man, right? So Iron Man is a superhero. He's an awesome superhero, super fun character. I love him 3000. He's awesome, right? So if you imagine how many good Iron Man stories you could tell across platform, as far as movies, games, comic books, right? I don't know. I guess that's arguable, but let's just say, for sake of argument, you could tell 100 great Iron Man stories across games, movies, books, comics, everything, right? So there's a certain amount of story potential that is tied to an individual character. Okay, but if we take one superhero and elevate that superhero to a group of superheroes, what you do is you increase the story potential of your world. And by increasing the story potential of your world, you increase the revenue potential of your world. So if you go from one superhero to a group of superheroes, in this case the Avengers, we can still tell the 100 great Iron Man stories, but now we can also tell the 100 great Captain America stories, and the 100 good Black Widow stories, and the 100 good Thor stories, and the 100 good Hulk stories, and the one good Hawkeye story, right? Like we've exponentially increased our story potential, which means we've also exponentially increased the revenue potential of the brand. So again, it doesn't necessarily alter the individual stories that you want to tell from a storytelling perspective, but from a brand perspective and a world perspective, you've increased that story potential without sacrificing the thing that you started with, which I think is super cool. And when it comes to superheroes, by the way, obviously superheroes, the trend in modern media is to develop by way of groups, right? Because groups of characters create more story potential than individual characters, right? And you just see this trend over and over and over again, right? Even something like, what's so smart about Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is that, we've seen that Peter Parker origin story 1,000 times, right? But what was cool about Into the Spider-Verse is, one, you had a fresh take by not having it be Peter Parker, Miles Morales, which is cool. But we went from one Spider-Man to a group of Spider people, right? With Peter Parker, Spider Gwen, Spider Pig, Spider Noir, right? Like, you had all the different Spider people, even the Japanese anime character Penny. Penny Parker, all those different spider people, because you have the multiverse. What that does is not just make for a fun individual movie, which Spider-Man was just awesome. Into the Spider-Verse was a great movie, but it increases story potential across platform, and that's why Sony has multiple Spider-Verse projects already in development. The crossovers, individual stories about Ghost Spider, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's because they're thinking of not just one Spider-Man, but a group of Spider people, therefore increasing the story potential of their brand. One Jedi becomes a group of Jedi. And then we have good ones and we have bad ones, right? So like Luke Skywalker could have been the only kid in the galaxy that could move things with his mind, right? He could have been, I mean, that could have been a creative choice by putting him as part of a group and saying there's good ones and there's bad ones, right? Now we can tell the same amount of good Luke Skywalker stories, but now we can tell Obi-Wan stories and Qui-Gon stories and Yoda stories and Darth Vader stories and Darth Maul stories and Dooku stories and Sidious stories, right? Increases story potential across platform and just gives some interesting world building complexity and depth that you wouldn't have otherwise either, I think, which is pretty important, right? We go from one child wizard to what? A group of children wizards, a whole school of children who want to be wizards, right? Harry could have been, I mean, think about this. I mean, J.K. Rowling could have made the creative decision where Dumbledore brought Harry in and just trained him by himself how to be a wizard, rather than putting him in an entire school. He could have just been an apprentice, right? But there's no way, I don't think she could have gotten 7 books, 8 movies, 10,000 extra pages of digital material and Pottermore, a new video game coming out, a follow-up stage play, 5 different Fantastic Beasts spinoffs that are in development. Like, I don't think you would have gotten all that if it would just been one kid. The way you get that is you say one child wizard becomes a group of children who want to be wizards. Super easy, right? Think about this. Think about Castaway. This is one guy who gets stuck on an island. One guy crashes on an island. When you have a story with one guy crashing on an island, you have one really good story about a dude crashing on an island, right? This is a great movie, but the story potential of this brand is limited to that singular movie. And maybe you get the Wilson spinoff animation short or whatever, but you can't really mine it for much more than that, right? So what do? We go from one person crashed on an island to what? A bunch of people crashed on an island. Now, whether you like Lost or whether you didn't like Lost, I just personally, I loved Lost. I thought Lost was great. I thought Lost was a masterclass in a lot of ways. Didn't love everything about it, obviously, but I think there was more things to love about Lost than not to like about Lost. But the most interesting thing is, when you think back, they went 7 seasons, but that's when TV seasons were like 22, 21 episodes per season. And so they had to get 140, 130, 120 episodes out of this story. There's no way to get 120 hours worth of story out of one guy crashed on an island, right? The only way you get that is to have, 10, 12, 13 people crashed on an island. And that increases the story potential, which increases those storytelling opportunities, obviously. And then they actually had some cool transmedia stuff where they extended across platform by adding other groups in as the Others and the Dharma Initiative and things like that. Some really super cool early transmedia stuff going on there in Lost, right? So you see the mechanic. The mechanic here is we have to train ourselves to say not just one character, but we're going to pull that character up into a group, and therefore increasing story potential. When you think about King Kong, what's the high concept of King Kong? The high concept of King Kong is just a big animal, right? He's a big monkey. And so when you take him to New York City, like the traditional King Kong movie does, he's the only big monkey in New York City. And at the end of King Kong, the traditional movie, King Kong dies. And so when he dies, the high concept dies with him, because the high concept that was attached to this individual character. And that's why you can only sort of keep redoing the same story over and over when it comes to King Kong. But what was cool about Kong Skull Island is that when you go to Skull Island, there isn't just one big animal in Skull Island. You go from one big animal, which is the big monkey of King Kong, but now there is a giant spider there, there's a giant octopus, there's a giant yak, there's giant bugs, there's giant dinosaur things called skull crawlers, right? It's just the high concept now has been elevated to a group, which increases story potential. Now you could take King Kong out of that story world and the high concept still remains, right? So that if you remember, I always like to have my rule of thumb is asking, can you take the main character out of your story and still have something interesting? At this point, the more nuanced way to ask that question is, are you able to remove your character from your story and still have a high concept intact? And now with Skull Island, you can, which is cool. And so you can see the King Kong in the modern media market now being constructed very differently, constructed around the story world of Skull Island rather than just like focusing on that individual character. And then even then, the Skull Island is that primary location that they built out for King Kong, but that secondary location, that broader story world, is now that same story world as Godzilla. And guess what the high concept of Godzilla and Mothra and all those crazy things are? They're big animals, right? Big lizard, big bug, right? And so you see that high concept now being extended out to that secondary location, which then envelops the entire world, and as sort of as a result of the Hollow Earth theory, which is super interesting. So anyway, you just see how these things have been constructed, and they've been constructed not by singular characters, but by groups of characters. You know, one super recent example is that I always say is, you know, the traditional examples that I give are every now and then, like historically, you could build James Bond or Sherlock Holmes and build brands around singular characters. Now it's kind of tougher to do. Things are developed around groups. But Sherlock Holmes is one of those examples that I always give, to where can you take Sherlock Holmes out of Sherlock Holmes and still have something interesting? And not really. You can't really do that, right? Because it's built around him as a character. But what's cool is the new Netflix movie Enola Holmes now is elevating Sherlock into a group of different the Holmes family, right? So now we have Sherlock Holmes, but then we have Enola Holmes, which is his sister. Now, are you able to take Sherlock Holmes out? Of course you can, right? Because you have that high concept still intact with Enola, which is awesome. You can still tell individual Sherlock Holmes stories, but now you can tell an infinite amount of Enola Holmes stories, increasing that story potential of the brand, right? Super, super important mechanic that we would need to understand. You can go from like one teacher to a group of teachers. We can go from one cop to the entire police force. We go from one gang member to the gang. We go from, you know, one lion to the pride of lions, one alien to the, you know, the entire, you know, alien civilization. We want to think in big groups. And as we think in big groups, it increases story potential across the platform, right? And so how many groups do we need, right? So the more groups, the merrier there, right? That's what that says. More groups, the merrier. So we take one character and we increase that, or we elevate that character to a group, right? But then we also can actually add multiple groups. And so if you look at something like Lord of the Rings, you go from one hobbit to a group of hobbits, right? But there aren't just hobbits. There's hobbits and elves and dwarves and men and wizards and dragons and orcs and goblins and urukai and, you know, everything in between. It's just group after group after group after group after group after group after group, and it just populates the world and elevates the world in this really amazing way. And the more characters and the more groups of characters you have populating that world is just going to be more dynamic. What's super interesting is if you look at Star Wars. Star Wars did a couple interesting things. George Lucas did a couple interesting things. So when he was building out the world of Star Wars, is, you know, he in the first movie we have a smuggler, we have a Jedi master, right? We have certain tropes that he leaned on, but between the first Star Wars movies, but Episode 4 and Empire Strikes Back, that was sort of a tenuous time for Star Wars because Mark Hamill had almost died in a car accident. Harrison Ford hadn't signed on for the sequel yet, right? And so George Lucas was looking at the prospect of having to do The Empire Strikes Back without the two main characters, and that was obviously probably not going to be good for the franchise. And so obviously Mark Hamill lived and Harrison Ford signed on. But immediately you see a tactical decision by George Lucas to begin to make backups of all the characters. And so starting with The Empire Strikes Back, we have Han Solo, who's the roguish smuggler. And then in Empire Strikes Back, we're introduced to another roguish smuggler named Lando, right? Obi-Wan Kenobi is the Jedi Master in Star Wars: A New Hope. But then in Empire Strikes Back, we're introduced to another Jedi Master in Yoda. Darth Vader is the big bad evil magician that rules the galaxy in Star Wars: A New Hope. But then in Empire Strikes Back, you really begin to be introduced to the Emperor, right? Who is another evil magician ruling the world or the galaxy. So it's just interesting how, and then even obviously even into going into it, you find out there's another Skywalker, right? Luke Skywalker isn't even just the only Skywalker, which is an interesting move. And so what you see George Lucas doing is he's making backups, right, of all the characters. He's saying, okay, I can't just have all my eggs in one character basket. I need to elevate each one of these characters into a group of characters, at least have backups of these characters. One, for just hedging the risk of entertainment. But then two, as you develop bounty hunters, a group of bounty hunters, you see that decision made in The Empire Strikes Back when he wants the bounty hunt. He wants Boba Fett to catch Han Solo. He doesn't just have one bounty hunter. He's not just talking to Boba Fett. He has a group of bounty hunters there, right? When you go into the cantina scene, there's lots of different characters that have been developed, and so it's just interesting how George kind of put that thing together. When Ernst & Young, which is an auditing firm, went into Lucasfilm to do what's called a valuation on the company, when Disney wanted to purchase it, they had to come up with a purchase price, right? They ended up buying it for $4.2 billion. But in order to come up with $4.2 billion, they sent this forensic auditing accounting firm into Lucasfilm to kind of go through all their assets and come up with a price tag, right? And they came up with $4.2 billion. But the thing they said that was the most valuable asset that Lucasfilm had wasn't sort of the original archives, wasn't the original films, wasn't the logo or anything like that. The most valuable asset that Lucasfilm and Star Wars had in their collection was simply the number of characters that they had in development. And they had over 14,000 characters that either had been developed and already been released, and or maybe in development that haven't been released. 14,000 characters that had been sketched out for the Star Wars universe. And they said that was the most valuable asset that Lucasfilm owned. So you have to ask yourself, why would a bunch of accountants consider that the most valuable asset? Because 14,000 characters means there's 14,000 stories, and 14,000 stories means there's 14,000 ways to make money, which is awesome, right? Like, it increases story potential of your brand. So what we want to do is we want to get as many characters as possible, and the way to do that is we think in groups, and obviously the more groups, the merrier when we develop. So how do we know how many groups we need, and how do we create said groups in a way that makes sense and doesn't make everything feel the same? We are going to use some tried and true Dungeons and Dragons philosophy here as we create these things, as we create 9 specific groups using what I call group alignments, okay? Group alignments. And so I'm sure you guys have heard of Dungeons and Dragons, but maybe even played Dungeons and Dragons, but just in case you haven't, the way you play Dungeons and Dragons is you make a character and then you play that character not as you, but as that character, like you're an actor, right? So the way you respond to a situation isn't the way the way I respond to a situation isn't how Houston would respond, but how my character would actually respond in that situation. So you have to know a little bit about the worldview of that character in order to be able to make a decision on how that character would act in the midst of this particular situation. And so the way to do that is you have an alignment chart, a character alignment chart, and you have two spectrums. You have a horizontal spectrum that goes from orderly or lawful, sometimes referred to as lawful, to all the way over to chaotic. And that spectrum is how well do you follow rules, right? If you're orderly or lawful, you always follow rules. If you're chaotic, you never follow rules. If you're neutral, you're somewhere in between. Vertical spectrum on the left is the spectrum of just your morality. Are you a good guy? Are you a bad guy? Or are you somewhere in between, sort of this shades of gray sort of a character, right? So this then creates 9 very specific options, boxes for you to fall in according to this matrix. So what I want to do is, when you're world building, you want to begin the process of creating 9 very specific character groups, 1 for each of these boxes, okay? 1 for each of these boxes. So, so the first group is lawful good, right? Orderly good, and it's a righteous group. And I'm going to go through each one of these one by one and explain them. But first, I'm going to explain them based on individual characters, and then based on those individual characters, just to build concept, we'll then elevate it to a group. Okay. So let's start with righteous. This is orderly good, and so righteous are good people who always follow rules. They're devoted to rules. They love rules. They think that following the rules is the reason that they're good. And so, so this is your paladin knight group, right? So, a character who would be in this group would be Superman, right? It's Superman. He's a good guy, obviously, but he also always follows the rules. And so, if you watch, Man of Steel, for example, he gives himself up to the general, lets them handcuff him, not because he knows it's just for show, but those are the rules. In Batman versus Superman, he shows up at a Senate hearing, not because he has to, obviously he's strong enough to do whatever he wants, but because those are the rules. If Superman got called to jury duty, he would show up, right? And that's just the kind of character he is. Optimus Prime, I think, would be in this box. I think Spock is in this box in Star Trek. He always talking about the Prime Directive and very concerned about stuff like that. I think Obi-Wan Kenobi is very much in this box. I mean, I think that sets him apart from Qui-Gon in the Phantom Menace, and very much sort of following the leading of the Jedi Council and et cetera, et cetera. I think he's in that box. I think Ned Stark from Game of Thrones is in this box. If you watch Game of Thrones and you remember this scene from the pilot, Ned Stark does not want to cut this guy's head off at all. But he does cut this guy's head off simply because it's the rules. It's the rules of the land and the law of the land and the tradition that he has to follow. So a group that would be in here would be your traditional Paladin Knights, Knights of the Round Table, that group. That would be here. I think the group of wizards, the Order of Wizards in Lord of the Rings, would be here. Now, individuals in this group may act a little differently, as we'll get into. But from a group perspective, I think the organization would be here. And I think overall, the entire group of Jedi would be here, right? The Jedi Council. Now, individual Jedis may be outside of this group, but again, at this point, we're at a 30,000 foot view of the IP. And so we're really kind of designing from large scale groups right now, not just individuals. And so as a group, I think the Jedi Order would be here. Obviously good guys. They have a code. I think they have too many rules, but they do have lots of rules, and they take pride in being able to abide by them. So so those are your righteous characters, right? So let's move to the next box. This is neutral good, what I call the humane characters. And so humane characters, they believe that they're good people, obviously good guys, good girls who prefer to follow rules, but are willing to break the rules if it means that they can achieve a greater good. Okay, and so again, the following the rules is a preference, but if they need to break them to achieve a greater good, they will. Okay, they're not bound by the rules. So I think the greatest example of this would be individually would be Captain America. I mean, obviously Captain America is a good guy, but Captain America breaks the rules a lot. Not that he loves it. I mean, he would rather just like play by the rules, I think. But the fact that, you know, in Captain America: First Avenger, all his buddies, the Howling Commandos, got captured behind enemy lines, and nobody was going to go save him, and he wasn't supposed to go into the actual battlefield. But so what do you think he does? He defies those rules, goes behind enemy lines, and saves all those people. So did that violate the rules? Yes. Did it achieve a greater good? Yes. Right. So this is even when the Sokovia Accords came about. He was supposed to sign. He didn't sign. He became a fugitive with his friend Bucky. Not because he loves to break the rules, but because he reluctantly did it in order to achieve that greater good. Daredevil, I think, is in this group, right? He would prefer that the cops caught all the bad guys, but unfortunately, the cops don't catch all the bad guys, which forces him to have to go out and achieve that greater good by catching those bad guys. I think individually, Gandalf is here, right? So Gandalf kind of defies the order of the council, the Wizard Council, quite often. So even though the organization of those wizards is in one group, in one box, individuals can kind of float around a little bit, right? Which gives you a little bit of freedom in your storytelling as well. I think Luke Skywalker is here, right? Like he defies Yoda's wishes to go try to save his friends in Cloud City, right? Like he isn't sort of your typical Jedi when it comes to his devotion to the Jedi Order. So I think I would put him in this box. I think Anakin Skywalker is here as well. I mean, like he was consistently breaking the rules of the Jedi Council. Same with Qui-Gon, right? And which makes these characters fun. I think Jack Bauer is in this group. If he didn't have to step outside the lines to catch the terrorist, he would. He wouldn't, but because the way the system is, it kind of ties your hands. He has to kind of operate outside the boundaries of the law a little bit, right? I think Robin Hood and the Merry Men would be a group that would be here, right? They are technically breaking the rules by stealing from the rich, but they are doing it for a greater good to be able to take care of the poor. And the things that they're stealing is illegally taxed goods anyway. It's illegal tax money. So they feel, even though it's technically wrong, technically against the rules, because it achieves that greater good, they're justified in doing so. And I think as a whole, as a group that would be here, the Howling Commandos as a group would be a great group to put in this box, right? Not just one character of Captain America, but a group of Howling Commandos to put around him, which increases that story potential. So let's go to chaotic good. I think chaotic good, honestly, is my favorite when I play RPG. It's my favorite box to be in. These transcendent groups. I think the most fun heroes come from this group, right? Typically either humane or transcendent, but particularly transcendent is cool because these are good guys who hate rules, right? They love to buck the system. They look for opportunities to break the rules, right? But that's the same time, they're still good guys. I think Mal from Firefly is here. I think 007 is here, right? I think that Conan the Barbarian is here. I think Han Solo is here. I think Batman is here. Especially in sort of the Dark Knight iterations of Batman, he doesn't reluctantly go fight the bad guys. He looks for the opportunity to instill fear into the bad guys. He doesn't reluctantly brand them with his bat symbol. He gets an enjoyment out of it because there's a darkness in his soul, right? And that's part of the Dark Knight vibe, right? And that's what separates him from some of the other the characters. I think the Punisher is here. The Punisher doesn't reluctantly go and kill all the bad guys. Like he's excited about it. He looks forward to it, right? He wouldn't be able to operate if he was forced to operating just by the rules. I think he necessarily operates outside of those rules just because that's his nature. But at the same time, he's still a good guy, right? He's not killing innocent people. He's killing the bad guys, etc. So I think he's always positioned as good. I think the Bad Batch from the Clone Wars cartoons and Star Wars would be here, right? They're good guys, but at the same time, they kind of do their own thing and really don't operate in sort of the prototypical function of the rest of those clone troopers, right? Of just being told what to do. They're sort of these free agents that kind of have their own way forward. So what's interesting about this is as we go to the next box, what this does is it gives a really interesting dimension to the conflict in the world. So obviously, when you're building the character groups, you're naturally going to have conflict between good guys and bad guys, right? Good and evil. So that vertical spectrum is obviously going to have conflict. But by doing it this way, you still have conflict between good and evil, but now you also have conflict between good guys. And so righteous characters will always conflict with transcendent characters. Humane characters will conflict with transcendent characters. And you see this in Batman versus Superman, right? Batman versus Superman. There's a philosophical difference in how Batman and Superman see the world, which makes them always bicker and fight. And they're both good guys, right? They're still good guys, but one's righteous, one's transcendent. If you watch the second season of Daredevil, who is a humane character, he fights with the Punisher, who's transcendent, and they have a philosophical difference. The Punisher, Daredevil says to the Punisher, you can't just be judge, jury, and executioner. You have to somehow funnel these people into the system. And the Punisher scoffs at that and says, "You're a half measure. You beat them up and put them in jail. They get out 2 weeks later and they rape somebody else. You might as well just put a bullet in their head and call it good," right? So are they still both good guys? Yes. But do they have a philosophical difference that leads to conflict? Of course they do, right? So not only do you build the conflict between good guys and bad guys, but you also add an extra dimension of conflict by having good guys and good guys conflict, or bad guys and bad guys conflict, or anything in between, right? And so the reason we want more conflict is that the conflict feeds drama, and drama is the heart of storytelling. Just increases story potential and just adds an extra dimension of interest into your world, right? Which I think is pretty cool. So let's talk about orthodox characters. This is lawful or orderly neutral. And these characters, they just always do their job, right? So orthodox characters always do their job. They're not good, they're not bad, but they sort of have their marching orders and they stick to it, right? I think Vito Corleone is here. I think Jules from Pulp Fiction is here. Is he a good guy or a bad guy? Well, he's kind of both, right? He's kind of good and bad. But what do we know about Jules is he always does what Marcellus Wallace says, right? He really he always follows those instructions to the T. And he has a personal code that he follows as well, right? But again, you can't really say he's a good guy. We like him, but we can't really say he's a good guy necessarily. I think the Grim Reaper is here as a character. The Grim Reaper is an interesting character because like the dude's just doing his job, right? Like, is he evil? Not necessarily. Like, he just has a job description that forces him to go out and do this sort of a dark thing to take people to the underworld, right? But at the same time, it's just his job. And so he's not really a good guy or a bad guy. He's just doing his job, right? I think droids are here as a whole. Individually, maybe you can kind of parse some of these droids out, like R2-D2 and BB-8, right? But overall, droids are things that have programming, and they do what they're programmed to do. And you see this in C-3PO, where as soon as he's given to Jabba the Hutt, Jabba the Hutt makes him sentence all his best friends to die an awful death in the Sarlacc pit, and he does it. Right, he doesn't fight back against it. He does it because that's what he's programmed to do. Right, so droids would be a good group here. I think the agents in the Matrix are a good group to put here, right? Because the agents are just they're following programming. They're following just what they're programmed to do. So really, the Matrix is the bad guy, but these individual agents are sort of these just foot soldiers that are just kind of doing what they're programmed to do. Not necessarily good, bad. Obviously they're the antagonists of the movie, but they're not really thinking for themselves, right? They just are just kind of following these orders. I think in Castlevania, right? You have the Belmonts as a group that you could put in this group. Like, are the Belmonts good or the Belmonts bad? Well, they're fighting against the vampires, so they're kind of good, but at the same time, there's a lot of bad stuff that the Belmonts do as well, and so they're sort of morally neutral. But they have a code. They have a legacy that they stand by, and they're sort of bound by their history, their code, and their legacy to follow in the Belmont footsteps. So I would put the Belmonts as a group in this box. Okay. So now we're going to get to the pragmatic box. This is neutral. And so neutral is pretty easy. These people are just free agents. Pragmatic groups are just always for sale. They can swing any way, right? There's sort of these wild cards in your world, right? I think Mike from Breaking Bad is here. I think the Ints as a whole are this in the world of Lord of the Rings, right? Like, there's sort of this free agents, and you're not sure exactly whether they always go with the good guys or the bad guys. Sort of like really kind of self-focused in their self-preservation. I think Boba Fett is here. I think Braun from Game of Thrones is here. Is he good or bad? It's kind of both. Does he follow rules? Sometimes. Does he break the rules? Sometimes. It depends on who's paying him, right? If you pay him to break the rules, he'll break the rules. If you pay him to follow the rules, he'll follow the rules. You pay him to be good, he'll be good. You pay him to do bad, he'll do bad, right? He can go any which way, depending, right? I think the elves, especially if you watch The Hobbit, like the elves are very much pragmatic. They aren't really positioned as morally good, and they're really kind of focused on their self-interest more than anything, right? So the Witchers, I think, would be here. Mercenaries in general, sellswords, mercenaries, bounty hunters, merchants. These are all groups that could exist in this box. So now we want to go to autonomous. Okay, so autonomous is chaotic neutral. So these are people that are morally gray, but they're free spirits. They crave self-direction. They're not necessarily good, bad. All we know about them is that they can't really exist in somebody else's rule system, right? And so Vic Mackey from The Shield, I think, is here. Stone Cold Steve Austin is here. Like, is he a good guy, bad guy? Well, sometimes both, right? But all we know about Stone Cold is Stone Cold does what Stone Cold wants, right? Marv from Sin City is here. I think Joel from The Last of Us is here. Gollum, Smeagol, I would put here. Jack Sparrow, I would put here. With Jack Sparrow, I think you know, is he a good guy, bad guy? Kind of both, right? But all we know about Jack Sparrow is he just does what Jack Sparrow wants, which makes him like he couldn't breathe if he had to follow somebody else's rules. There's just no way he's following somebody else's rules. He's a free spirit, just needs to kind of be doing his own thing. That's what makes him fun. I would put Deadpool here. I don't think Deadpool's a good guy or a bad guy. He's a little bit of both, right? But the reason he could never be an X-Men is because, you know, he just would not be able to survive under Professor X's rules. And, you know, he's a little bit bad as well, but very much of a free spirit. I think Loki is here. Loki is good and bad. I think he ends up ending on a good note, right? At least in the MCU. But you know, he's very much going to be built on mischief. He can't, no matter how hard he tries, he can't really follow other people's rules. I think hippies as a group are here, right? Hippies just want to be left alone to, like, you know, grow their own food and, like, you know, do whatever they want to do outside the purview of the government, right? So hippies are very much even extreme, like, preppers and libertarians may be here as well as a group. I think the fight club as a group would be here, right? They're not necessarily good or bad necessarily, right? But you know, until the end of the Fight Club movie, when this sort of takes a dark turn. But sort of at the height of the actual Fight Club, they're just some dudes that want to do their own thing. They just want to kind of you know, operate in their own system, and that's what makes them interesting as a group. So now let's start talking about the bad guys. Okay, bad guys. So the first bad guy group is lawful or orderly evil, and we call that group an ascendant group. And so ascendant groups are they are bad guys that are ideological bad guys that have codes. Okay, they abide by codes, and so this is sort of your religious bad guy, for lack of a better word. So ideology is really the big thing that we're going to be looking for when we're looking at these ascendant bad guys. I think Magneto is here. I think Anton Chigurh is here. So if you watch No Country for Old Men, there's a gas station scene where so it's a great example of dramatic tension, but like, he wants to kill that old guy so bad in that gas station scene, but he doesn't kill that old guy because he flips the coin. He has a code that says if he flips the coin and has tails, he doesn't kill you, right? Or whatever it is. He's bound by the coin flip, almost like Two-Face, right? That there's a code, and it's his own code, and he follows it no matter what, which makes him an interesting character. I think Darth Vader is here. I think he's a little bit more ideological than the Emperor. So I put Darth Vader here. Thanos is like one of the greatest villains of our generation, is here. He very much has a code. He has an ideology of balance that really that drives him, right? Of destiny, of balance, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what he's not necessarily trying to take over the galaxy to rule it, right? He's driven by ideology, not power, and that's what makes him ascendant. I think a group that would be here would be the Nazgul. The Nazgul, sort of this religious order that has a code. They always follow those rules, the rules of Sauron. I think the Yakuza would probably be here as well, right? They're very much code-driven bad guys. So those are the ascendant groups. Again, what you're looking for is bad guys that have a code, a very strong, strict code, and an ideology. But now, as we shift over into the ambitious group, which is neutral evil, okay? The ambitious group, these are bad guys that crave power. So the big difference between ambitious and ascendant is ambitious bad guys want power, and are driven by power, whereas the ascendant group is driven by ideology, right? That's the big line that we're going to draw between those two groups. So Cersei Lannister from Game of Thrones is here. I think Biff Tannen is here. Littlefinger is here in Game of Thrones. I think individually Saruman from Lord of the Rings is here. I think Palpatine is here. and I think he's different than Darth Vader because he's driven by power, wanting to rule everybody. Whereas Darth Vader is a little bit more ideological in the way he approaches the galaxy. Hydra, as a group, you put Hydra here. Hydra wants to take over the world, right? They're not necessarily driven by an ideology. Maybe they are to some extent, but really the thing that they're looking for is power, right? So that is really what's going to help you define what is a ascendant or ambitious group, right? So now let's talk about chaotic evil, which is a self-indulgent group, which basically these are your monsters. They're driven by hedonism, right? So they crave evil. Let me put myself up here for just a second. They crave evil and have just like a darkness in their soul that makes them want to do evil stuff, right? And so they're not trying to gain power. They aren't really driven by an ideology. They're just driven by a darkness in their soul, a hedonism that makes them want to do evil stuff. So I think the greatest example of this would be the Joker. The Joker doesn't want to take over Gotham City. The Joker just wants to sow chaos because there's a darkness in his soul. He's a broken person that wants to sow chaos, right? That makes him different than the Penguin. The Penguin wants to take over, right? He doesn't, which is why he's self-indulgent. Ramsay Bolton from Game of Thrones, I think would be here. I think the Rancor is here. I think King Joffrey is here from Game of Thrones. The only reason he wants to be king is just to torture people and do evil things. He doesn't necessarily want the responsibility of ruling and the power. Like Cersei, his mom, is different. Cersei wants the power. He just wants the ability to do evil, awful things to people. I think the Wolf of Wall Street is here. I think a group that would be here would be the Gremlins, right? They're not trying to take anything over. They're just trying to like sow mischief and chaos, right? As a group. And zombies would be here. They're not trying to take over the world. They just want to eat everyone's brains because that's the hedonistic desire that's sort of built into their DNA. And so, so hopefully you see sort of the ideological difference between these groups: ascendant, ambitious, self-indulgent. The same with righteous, humane, transcendent, and obviously that neutral line: orthodox, pragmatic, and autonomous. And so, so once you understand the ideology of each group, what you want to do when you world build is you want to go and you want to develop one group, not a character, a group that would fit every single box. And if you can do more than 9, that's fine too. But as a starting point, try to get one group in every single box. And that way, to start your world building and to start your storytelling, you've increased story potential because you've gone from one character to a whole group of characters, not just one group of characters, but now 9 groups of characters. So we've increased story potential, populated the world even more. But at the same time, what you've done is you've made all those groups ideologically different, which is going to increase conflict, which increases drama, which makes your stories even better. So again, one group for every box. And so, if you're looking at Harry Potter, you say, okay, what are the groups in Harry Potter? We got our Dementors and Death Eaters and the Hogwarts kids and the Ministry of Magic and the Order of the Phoenix. And you're thinking group and group and group, and you could put them in these boxes, right? And there may be some boxes that aren't filled out yet, and you would have to fill those out moving forward. But we want to, again, put one group in every single box. And then once you have those boxes filled, right, go back to your map and give all your groups what I call a headquarters, right? So reflect where they would be on the map. And so if you have school teachers as a group, make sure on your map we know where the schools are. If you have cops as a group in your character alignments, then make sure the police station is on the map, right? So just make sure that these story locations are marked on your map, and that helps even better define your map. And then we have something that we've built out in a good way that gives us all of our character groups. So again, the big philosophy here is we don't want to be thinking about individuals. We need to think about groups, because groups of characters increase story potential for your world. And then we don't want to just think about one group. We want lots of groups. And the way we're going to develop that is a very specific mechanic, is using character alignments from D&D. These group alignments going to give us 9 very specific groups that are all ideologically different. And we're going to use those groups as a starting point to then populate the world. And again, if you want to throw more groups in there, that's fine. But at least start with those 9 and then have your map reflect them, and then we'll be good. So hopefully this was helpful in your pursuit of character groups and populating your world. And the next video that we'll discuss is we're going to take one of your groups and we're going to define that even more. But this is the starting point for the population of your story world.